In the spring of 1934, 47 patients vanished from Millhaven Asylum in a single week, not escaped, not transferred, not discharged. The institution's own records for those 7 days in April of 1934 show 47 names present on Monday morning and absent by the following Sunday, with no corresponding discharge papers, no transfer orders, no death certificates, and no notation of any kind explaining where those 47 people went. The state of Virginia launched an investigation. The investigation produced a report. The report was filed, and then, for reasons that nobody has ever been able to fully explain, the matter was quietly closed, and the 47 names disappeared from the official record as completely as the people they belonged to had disappeared from the institution. This is the story of what happened at Millhaven Asylum in April of 1934, and why, 90 years later, it is still not fully answered. Before we go any further, if you're the kind of person who hears a number like 47 and needs to know what's behind it, stay with me, because what the investigation found, and what it chose not to find, and what researchers working from the surviving documents have been able to piece together in the decades since, is a story that goes considerably deeper than any single week in April. Drop a comment and tell me what you think happened. I want to know where your mind goes with this one. Our story begins in 1901, the year Millhaven Asylum opened on a hillside in the Shenandoah Valley, in a county whose primary industries were apple orchards and a single limestone quarry that employed most of the men who didn't work the land. Millhaven was built as a county-level institution rather than a state one, funded by a consortium of 5 neighboring counties who had pooled resources to build a shared facility for their combined mentally ill populations, a common arrangement in rural Virginia during this era, and one that produced, as we'll see, a set of accountability structures, or more precisely, a set of accountability gaps that would matter enormously 3 decades later when the disappearances occurred. The institution's first superintendent was a physician named Dr. Harold Crane, who served from Millhaven's opening in 1901 until his retirement in 1928. A 27-year tenure that shaped the institution's character in ways that, looking back, made what happened in 1934 almost predictable, even if nobody predicted it. Crane was not a cruel man by the standards of his era, and not particularly an incompetent one. His surviving annual reports show a physician engaged, at least in the institution's early years, with the genuine medical questions of his time. What Crane was, by every indication in the documentary record, was a man who believed, with the complete conviction of someone who had never been seriously challenged on it, that what happened inside Millhaven's walls was Millhaven's business, and that the 5 county boards that nominally oversaw the institution were best served by receiving reassuring annual reports and staying out of the operational details. For 27 years, the 5 county boards did exactly that. The institution Crane built and ran across those 27 years was, by the surviving accounts of staff who worked under him, a tightly controlled, inward-facing place, not dramatically different from comparable institutions of the era in its treatment practices, but distinctive in the degree to which Crane had built a culture of internal loyalty and external opacity that left almost no meaningful channel for outside scrutiny. Staff who raised concerns internally were, by multiple accounts collected decades later, handled through reassignment or quiet pressure, rather than through any formal process. Family members who asked uncomfortable questions about relatives' conditions were, according to surviving correspondence, managed through the same kind of non-answers that Clarence Webb had received from Coldwater around the same period. And the institution's records were maintained by Crane and his inner circle with a level of personal control that meant, in practice, that the records reflected what Crane chose to document, rather than a complete picture of what actually occurred. One staff member who worked at Millhaven during the final years of Crane's tenure and continued under Goss was a woman named Ethel Marsh, who served as a ward attendant from 1924 to 1936 and who gave a brief, carefully worded interview to a local newspaper in 1978, 44 years after the disappearances, that remains one of the only first-hand staff accounts of this period ever recorded. Ethel was 81 at the time of the interview and described herself, in her opening remarks, as someone who had thought carefully about whether to speak and had decided that at 81 there was no longer any practical reason not to. What Ethel described about the spring of 1934 specifically was not a dramatic event, but an absence of events. A week or so, she said, during which certain patients she had known by name were simply no longer in their usual places, and during which the atmosphere on the ward had a quality she described as everyone knowing not to ask. She said that when she had asked a colleague where a specific patient named only as Old Walter had gone, the colleague had looked at her for a long moment and then said, very quietly, that Old Walter had been moved and that it wasn't worth asking about further. Ethel said she had understood, from the way it was said, that this was not a suggestion, but a direction. She did not ask again. "There are things you know not to press on," she said in the 1978 interview. "When you have a family to feed, and the work is the only work available. I am not proud of that, but I want people to understand that it was a real calculation, not a moral failure I made lightly." She also said, near the end of the interview, that she had thought about a specific patient named Ruth Calloway, a woman who had been on her ward for several years before the spring of 1934, and who was among those no longer present afterward, many times in the decades since. "She used to help me fold the laundry on Tuesday afternoons," Ethel said. "She was very precise about it. The corners had to be exactly right. I have folded laundry every week of my life since 1934, and I have thought about Ruth Calloway more times than I can count." She paused in the recording before adding, "I don't know what happened to her. I never found out. That's the part I want people to understand, that most of us who were there never found out either, and we spent the rest of our lives with that not knowing, same as the families did." When Crane retired in 1928, he was replaced by his own deputy superintendent, a man named Dr. Everett Goss, who had worked under Crane for 11 years and who had, by every available indication, absorbed his predecessor's operating philosophy entirely. Goss was 41 years old when he took over. He had no experience outside Millhaven, and he inherited not just Crane's position, but Crane's institutional culture, the insularity, the opacity, the deep conviction that Millhaven's internal affairs were Millhaven's to manage. What Goss also inherited, though he likely didn't think of it in these terms at the time, was an institution that had been building pressure for 30 years. An institution whose accountability structures had atrophied to the point where the 5 county boards that nominally governed it had, by 1928, been receiving polished annual reports for so long that they had essentially stopped expecting anything else. An institution whose staff had, over nearly 3 decades, learned that the way to survive there was to see less and say less and ask fewer questions. And an institution whose patient population, by 1928 somewhere over 400 people, well beyond its designed capacity, included a significant number of individuals who had been there for so long that their families, if they had families, had in many cases lost meaningful contact with them, and whose continued presence inside Millhaven was therefore less likely to generate the kind of outside inquiry that new or recently committed patients might attract. It was in this institution, in this moment, that the spring of 1934 arrived. The winter of 1933 into 1934 was, by every surviving account from the region, an exceptionally harsh one. Temperatures in the Shenandoah Valley that winter broke records that had stood for decades, and the apple orchards that sustained much of the county's economy suffered significant frost damage that would reduce yields and therefore county revenues for 2 seasons running. Millhaven's operating budget, funded through county appropriations, was cut in early 1934 for the second consecutive year. Surviving board minutes from February of that year document a meeting at which Dr. Goss presented a budget shortfall and requested emergency supplemental funding. The request was denied. The minutes record no further discussion of how the shortfall would be managed. The first indication that something unusual was occurring at Millhaven in the spring of 1934 comes not from any institutional record, but from a letter written by a woman named Agnes Foley, whose brother Thomas had been a patient at Millhaven since 1927. Agnes wrote to the institution on April 14, 1934, inquiring after her brother, as she did periodically, and received, unusually, no response. She wrote again on April 28th. Again, no response. She wrote a third time in May, this time addressing her letter to the 5 county boards rather than to the institution directly, asking them to verify that her brother was still a patient at Millhaven and in good health. Before we follow what Agnes's letter set in motion, I want to tell you a little about Agnes and Thomas Foley, because the investigation that followed her letter has, over the decades, received considerably more attention than the people who prompted it, and I think that's the wrong way around. Thomas Foley was committed to Millhaven in 1927 at the age of 34, following what his commitment record describes as a nervous collapse, language that, as we've seen in other records from this era, covers a wide range of actual experiences, from genuine severe mental illness to grief, to the kind of situational breakdown that a person with adequate support might have recovered from without any institutionalization at all. His intake record notes that he was a carpenter by trade, that he was unmarried, and that his next of kin was his sister Agnes, whose address in Harrisonburg, Virginia, is listed in careful handwriting at the bottom of the form. Agnes wrote to Millhaven 4 times in the 7 years between her brother's commitment in 1927 and her unanswered letter in April of 1934. The responses she received to her first 3 letters, which survive in the State Archive as part of the investigation file, are brief, formulaic, and almost entirely uninformative. Thomas is receiving appropriate care. Thomas is stable. Thomas is not currently available for visits, but the institution will notify her when visits are possible. There is no record of a visit ever being approved. There is no record of Thomas's condition ever being described in any specific clinical terms. What the letters convey, reading them now, is an institution that has acknowledged Agnes's existence precisely enough to prevent her from escalating, while giving her nothing that would allow her to understand what her brother's life actually looked like inside Millhaven. Agnes Foley's third letter, the one that triggered the investigation, is in the State Archive. The woman at the Historical Society showed me a photocopy of it. It is a single page, handwritten in a careful, educated hand, the kind of letter a woman writes when she has been patient for a very long time and has finally decided that patience is no longer serving her. Agnes writes that she simply wants to know if her brother is well. She writes that she has not received a response to her previous letters. She writes that she is asking the county board because she does not know who else to ask, and that she hopes they will understand that her request is a simple one, not an accusation, not a complaint, simply a sister asking after her brother. The letter is dated April 28, 1934. Agnes Foley's third letter is the document that triggered the state investigation. It arrived at the Rockingham County Administrative Office on May 9, 1934, and was read by a county clerk named Harold Sims, who, by his own account, given in a 1949 interview that represents the most detailed surviving description of what happened next, recognized immediately that the letter described a situation that required escalation. Sims contacted the Virginia State Board of Health the same day. An investigator arrived at Millhaven 5 days later. What the investigator found, documented in the 43-page report filed with the State Board in June of 1934, was an institution that, on its surface, appeared to be functioning normally. Patients in their wards, staff on their shifts, records in their files. What the investigator also found, beneath that surface, was a discrepancy he described in the report as significant and not immediately explicable between the patient census records from the previous fall, which showed a population of 431, and the physical count conducted during the inspection, which came to 384. 47 patients, absent from the institution, with no documentation in any record the investigator could locate explaining their departure. The investigator's subsequent interviews with staff produced, by his own account in the report, a remarkable uniformity of response. Staff after staff, who described, in nearly identical terms, simply not knowing where the 47 patients had gone, or when they had left, or under what circumstances. The report notes, with evident frustration, that this uniformity of ignorance was itself suspicious, given that a reduction of 47 in a population of 400 would not be something that occurred without the knowledge of at least some portion of the staff on duty during the relevant period. Dr. Goss, interviewed at length, stated that the patients in question had been discharged or transferred during a period of administrative reorganization and that the paperwork for those moves had been misplaced. He could not specify what administrative reorganization meant in practice. He could not identify where the paperwork had been filed or what had happened to it. The report recommended a full audit of Millhaven's records going back 3 years. An independent count of the institution's current patient population, verified against family contacts where available, and a formal review of Dr. Goss's administrative practices by an independent panel. These recommendations were submitted to the 5 county boards in June of 1934. What happened next is where the mystery deepens in the specific way that has made this case compelling to researchers ever since. Because what the 5 county boards did with those recommendations, or more precisely, what they chose not to do, is documented, in stark terms, in the surviving board minutes from the summer and fall of 1934. The Rockingham County Board discussed the report at a July meeting and voted 4-1 to request a response from Dr. Goss, rather than implement the independent audit immediately. The other 4 county boards took no documented action on the report at all during this period. Goss's response, submitted in August, characterized the discrepancy as the result of documentation errors that had since been corrected and expressed confidence that the institution's records were now in order. The independent audit was never conducted. The patient count verified against family contacts was never performed. The formal review of Goss's administrative practices was never convened, and Agnes Foley never received a response that confirmed whether her brother Thomas was among the 47 unaccounted patients or among the 384 present at the time of the inspection. Thomas Foley's name does not appear in any surviving Millhaven discharge, transfer, or death record. It appears in the institution's intake log from 1927. It appears in ward assignment records through early 1934, and then it simply stops appearing, the way 46 other names stop appearing at roughly the same point in the surviving record, without explanation and without resolution. Researchers studying this case have, over the decades, proposed several explanations for what happened to the 47 patients, none of which can be confirmed from the available documentation, and all of which are, given the circumstances, plausible to varying degrees. The most straightforward explanation, that the patients were informally discharged or transferred during the budget crisis of 1933 to 1934, with paperwork that was lost or destroyed either accidentally or deliberately, would account for the timing and would be consistent with practices documented at other institutions facing similar financial pressures during the Depression era. A second explanation, more troubling, centers on the institution's cemetery, which occupies a small section of the Millhaven property, and whose burial records, like those of Coldwater and Graycliff before it, do not fully account for all of the grave sites that a 2008 ground-penetrating survey identified on the property. The survey found 61 probable individual burials against 44 documented in the surviving partial ledger, a gap that falls in the right numerical range to be relevant, but that cannot, from the survey alone, be dated with sufficient precision to confirm whether those additional burials correspond to deaths during the 1934 period specifically. A third possibility, the one that researchers have found most difficult to either confirm or fully dismiss, is suggested by a single document found in the Virginia State Archive in 2011 by a researcher named Dr. Caroline Vance, a historian at a Virginia university who had been studying the Millhaven case for several years and who found the letter while working through an uncatalogued box of administrative correspondence from the 1930s. The letter is a carbon copy of a communication from Dr. Goss to a private sanatorium in North Carolina, dated March of 1934, 1 month before the first patients were unaccounted for, discussing the transfer of suitable cases to the North Carolina facility at a rate that the letter describes as favorable, given current budgetary constraints. Dr. Vance's account of finding that letter, published in a 2013 academic paper on institutional accountability failures in Depression-era Virginia, describes the moment of reading it as one of the more disorienting of her research career. "The letter doesn't say anything explicitly incriminating," she wrote, "and that's precisely what makes it so troubling. It describes a transaction, a favorable rate, suitable cases. It uses the language of institutional management to describe what may have been the transfer of 47 human beings to a facility in another state without their family's knowledge or consent, and it does so in the matter-of-fact tone of someone who considers this a reasonable administrative response to a budget problem." She noted that the letter does not specify how many patients the transfer arrangement covered, does not name any individuals, and does not appear in any cross-reference in any other surviving Millhaven document. The North Carolina facility named in the letter, a private sanatorium called Pinehurst Manor, in the western part of the state, closed in 1941, 7 years after the date of Goss's letter. Its records, if they survived the closure, have not been located in any archive that Dr. Vance or subsequent researchers have been able to identify. The building itself was demolished in the 1950s. The land it stood on is now a residential subdivision. Dr. Vance has described the search for Pinehurst Manor's records as the central frustration of this entire research project. The one thread that, if it could be followed, might answer the question that 90 years of research has not yet answered, and that cannot be followed because the records that would answer it have, in all probability, simply ceased to exist. What Dr. Vance's 2013 paper did produce, beyond the letter itself, was the most comprehensive single accounting of what is and is not known about the 47 patients available in any published source. Of the 47 names identified as unaccounted for in the 1934 investigation report, Vance was able to trace 18 through other documentary sources, census records, death certificates filed elsewhere in Virginia or other states, family genealogy records, with sufficient confidence to conclude that those 18 had, at minimum, survived beyond the spring of 1934 and appeared in the historical record in contexts unconnected to Millhaven. For the remaining 29, she was able to find no documentary trace of any kind after their disappearance from Millhaven's records. 29 people, present in the institutional record through early 1934, and absent from every other record Vance and her research team were able to search. Thomas Foley is among the 29. I wanted to come here myself. We're out here now on the road that runs along the base of the ridge where Millhaven used to stand, and I want to be direct with you. The building is gone. It was demolished in 1962, 28 years after the disappearances, and there's farmland here now. Apple orchards, the same kind that have been in this valley since before the asylum was ever built. The blossoms are out this time of year, white and pink across the whole hillside, and it is genuinely beautiful, and there is nothing here that would tell you anything had ever stood in this spot if you didn't know to look. I called Dr. Vance before making this drive, and she agreed to talk with me for about 20 minutes, which turned into closer to an hour. She said that, in the 12 years since her paper was published, she had received more correspondence about the Millhaven case than about anything else she had ever written, from descendants of patients, from local historians, from people who had simply read about the case online and found themselves unable to let go of the number 47. She said the correspondence breaks into two categories almost without exception. One category is people who want answers, who are still actively searching for a specific name, a specific relative, and who write to her, hoping she has found something new. The other category is people who have made peace with not knowing, but who want to say, to someone who has studied this, that the not knowing has cost them something real, that they grew up in a family with a hole in it, a person who was there and then wasn't, and that the hole never closed because nothing ever filled it. She said one letter had stayed with her more than the others, from a woman in her 70s, whose grandmother had been a patient at Millhaven in 1934, and who was among the 29 Vance had been unable to trace. The woman wrote that she had spent most of her adult life assuming her grandmother had simply died at the institution and been buried there without anyone being notified, which was a sad enough story, but at least a finished one. Dr. Vance's paper, with its suggestion that some of the 47 might have been transferred to North Carolina rather than buried in Virginia, had reopened something the woman had thought was closed. She wrote that she now found herself, at 73, unable to decide which possibility was worse, that her grandmother had died at Millhaven and been buried in an unmarked grave, or that she had been transferred alive to a facility in another state, under conditions nobody had documented, and had ended her days somewhere even further from the family that had been trying to find her. Dr. Vance said she had read that letter several times before writing back. She said she had not had a good answer for the woman, and that she had written back saying so directly, and that the woman had thanked her for the honesty. The thing I keep coming back to, Vance told me, is that the 47 is the number that gets remembered, because it's specific and it's large enough to be shocking. But the real number, the number of people who spent years, sometimes their entire lives, not knowing what had happened to someone they loved who had gone into Millhaven, that number is much larger, and nobody has ever counted it, and I'm not sure it's countable. What happened to 47 patients at Millhaven Asylum in the spring of 1934 is, as of this recording, still not fully known. The investigation found the gap. The investigation was closed without filling it. Dr. Goss died in 1951, taking whatever he knew with him. The North Carolina facility is gone. The building is gone. And the names, Thomas Foley and 46 others, present in the records through early 1934, and then absent, are still there in the archive, waiting for an answer that 90 years of searching has not yet produced. If you know something about this case, or if your own family has a connection to Millhaven Asylum, I'd genuinely like to hear from you in the comments. This is the kind of story that sometimes gets answered not through archives, but through the people who are still carrying pieces of it. Thanks so much for watching. Stick around. There are more mysteries like this one waiting to be told, and I'd be glad to have you along as we find the next one.